Well, in my last video, we looked at the book of Acts to show why when I talk to non-believers about Jesus, I end up baptizing them. Because when you really talk about Jesus, just like they did in Acts, you talk about how you respond to that. After all, it'd be a terrible thing to tell people Jesus died for you and he wants you to follow him, but I'm not going to tell you how to do that. And in Acts, they always talked about being baptized. Now, when you read the letters to Christians, when you start reading in Romans and First Corinthians and all through Paul's letters and letters from Peter and others and all those letters to Christians, they talk about baptism differently. There's where you learn a lot about what baptism means. It's as if the writers of those letters to Christians spent a lot of time saying, you were baptized, let me remind you what that meant. And so sometimes when we talk about, okay, I want to convince this non-believer what baptism means, well, above all to them, it means following Jesus. But there are depths and layers of that. For instance, there's that great chapter in Romans 6 where Paul explains, don't you know when you were baptized, and then he explains it, that you were baptized into the death of Christ, you were buried with him and raised to a new life. And very much, especially in Paul, in the letters he writes to Christians, you have a lot of that reference to dying with Jesus, being raised with Jesus. He uses that terminology in Galatians when he says in chapter 2, you were crucified with Christ, so the life you live, you now live by faith in the Son of God, who loved you and gave himself for you. Of course, Galatians also in chapter 3 is where he explains, when you were baptized, you were clothed with Christ. Colossians, especially in chapter 2, has that language of, here's how you live because you died with Jesus. Here's how you live because you were raised with Jesus. And even back in Romans 6, of course, it's not just baptism, he explains. He spends the rest of chapter 6 explaining how you now live according to the Spirit because you were baptized and buried and raised. Here's how you live out your baptism. You read those, and it's not just Paul, by the way. You go over in 1 Peter, and you've got Peter reminding us that baptism, the water baptism we experienced, isn't just to get us clean physically. It's the appeal of a clean conscience to God. It's a matter of spiritual cleaning, not physical cleaning. Sometimes we've kind of treated baptism as a one and done. Here's the checklist you check off. If you want to follow Jesus, you do this, you do this, you do this, and baptism is one of those. Scripture doesn't really talk about it that way. They didn't in Acts. They didn't talk about it as the thing you do to become a Christian. They talked about it as the response to hearing the good news of Jesus about a dying and a being raised. And it seems that in those letters, that when they're writing to Christians to remind them of what they do when they were baptized, it's a lot about how you live out your baptism. So I'm going to tell you, baptism isn't something we do once. It's something we live out the rest of our lives as Christians because we do die and are buried with Jesus and are raised to a new life. So in Acts, you have a lot of, you need to be baptized, and in the letters to Christians, you have a lot of, and now let me remind you of why you needed to do that and how you live that out. So I'm telling you, if you're a Christian, one of the things I enjoy about talking to non-Christians, it reminds me of how important my commitment to Jesus was when I died and was buried and was raised to a new life, and how I want to continue to live that out. So let me encourage you to live your baptism. And for the non-Christian, I want to encourage you to respond to Jesus by dying with him and being raised, and then spend the rest of your life living out your forgiveness, living out your Spirit-led life. And so this is Steve Ridgell, being thankful God loved me enough to let Jesus die for me.